Well, hello. Welcome to the first of our Culture Club conversations. We decided that we'd make the most of the opportunity that we have with a little bit of maybe a bit of spare time to have a socially distant discussion about something that's really fundamental in the life of our church. So we decided that we'd have take some time over the next few weeks to talk a bit about culture, a little bit about why culture is so important to us, and about some of the distinctives that then define the culture of our church. Now, we appreciate that you could be coming from all over the place watching this. Maybe you're not part of our church, and this is maybe an insight into who we are and what makes us tick. But if you're planted at Proclaimers, then this is, fundamental to understanding who we are as a community and who we are as a church and how we can have an impact in our world. So we hope that the next 30 minutes or so is going to be enlightening and insightful. And we hope you'll be able to join us both for this and for the rest of the series that's to come. So we're going to be kicking off tonight. Before we get into some of the cultural points of our church, we're actually going to start off by exploring the whole idea of why culture is so important. So Pastor Tom, our lead pastor, is here with me. Pastor Tom, I know you've always been passionate about the idea of culture, and it was one of the first things that you started to work on when you first came to Proclaimers. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what culture is all about?
Sure. Coming from my perspective is really interesting because I was born in America until I was about 11 years old. I moved to Australia, a completely different culture. We're all the same color and we all speak the same language, but believe me, America and Australia are really, really different. And then for 12 and a half years, I lived in Asia and worked and ministered in 12, probably 13 other countries in the Asia region. Languages, cultural practices, religious practices, from Muslim Bangladesh to Buddhist Thailand to communist Vietnam. And so, working right across the spectrum. And then I came to the UK, which I thought was going to be an easy thing for me. But even though we all look the same and we all speak the same language, I tell you what, the UK was probably the most challenging bit of cross-cultural communication that I've probably ever had in my life. When I think of culture, I think of what pushed me in the area of wanting to, by intention, develop a culture in the life of our church. I remember very, very early, probably 15 years ago, I'd only been here for a year, and I went to Hillsong in London. At that time, they were at Blackfriars Theatre, the Mermaid Theatre, and I think I caught the 6th of the 7 services that they were doing that night. And I happened to find a little card which described the culture of that church. While I was sitting there for the entire service, I kept saying, I want a church like this. I want to lead a church like this. I want to pastor a church like this. Now, the church that I was currently leading was nothing like Hillsong London. And so I came home from that experience thinking to myself, how do I create a culture like that? And I realized that culture is created intentionally. It's not something that just happens. You can't pray about it. You can't hope for it. You can't put the name Hillsong on it and all of a sudden you're going to have Hillsong kind of culture. No, we had to create culture alongside of creating leadership and structures and language that went to describe exactly who we are. I suppose as someone that's always traveled across the world now, culture always hits me when I walk into a different hotel. Doubletree by Hilton. One of the little cultural things that they've always got is, as you walk up to the desk to sign in, there's a plate full of freshly baked cookies. And I always thought to myself, I like that hotel. Holiday Inn Express, you get nothing, expect nothing. They give you a room, you take everything up there. They don't want to know about you once you've checked in. The food is like, pretty basic, right? Then you go to the Radisson Blu, and not only have they got beautiful rooms, they've got great food. I've always found that a lot of hotels, they may have great rooms and services. The big thing that lets them down is food. One of the things that I said right at the beginning was, no more horrible instant coffee and rich tea biscuits, okay? We're going to have 12 different varieties of tea, phenomenal drip filter coffee. And in those days, we had muffins and donuts and and all sorts of, expensive things. We stopped that after a while because it was costing us £500 a month to do that. And I thought I could put somebody on staff for that money. But for me, that's where I began to understand culture. And I realized that it was really important that we had to create it and create it intentionally.
Yeah, I guess what you've highlighted so well there, Tom, is that every organization has a culture. I've got a helpful definition maybe of culture. A culture is the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. The ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. And I guess, every organization, just the same as any gathering of people, has a culture, right? It has those values and ethos, spirit and attitude. It has its way of doing things. They have what they value. And I think, as you've so clearly articulated, Tom, culture happens, and culture can either be formed by design or by default. And that's
right.
One of the things I learned really early on from you, Pastor Tom, was actually, culture will happen by default if you don't design it. That actually, every organization or every gathering of people will form a certain way of doing things. And if you're not intentional about it, you get the kind of default view, which may or may not be what you want. And I guess when you think about some of the world's most successful organizations, you've already mentioned a load of great examples, but, places like Apple, McDonald's, Starbucks, each of those is an organization with a really clearly defined sense of culture.
Yeah.
You can walk into an Apple store in Norwich or London or
Beijing,
and they're the same.
Exactly.
Same, and not just the same in terms of their layout, in terms of their products, but actually the way that you are treated by the team, the way that you're spoken to, the language that they use. All of these things are things that have been organized by design.
Yeah. One of the things that I said I wanted in the life of our church was I wanted a group of people that would be from the car park to the front door through to the auditorium, that would be a group of people that would welcome people in a way that was meaningful and sincere and authentic. I wanted our hosting team and the people in the life of our church to have at least 4 or 5 meaningful conversations with people before the service was over. That was one thing that I really wanted in the life of our church. One of the other things is that we had a kids ministry where parents could walk in 45 minutes early if they wanted to, drop their kids off into kids, come back into the auditorium, the atrium, and enjoy 45 minutes worth of adult conversation. Yeah. These were things which were by design. If we'd just left it to somebody else to come up with it, it would be by default.
Yeah. Yeah, because I guess those are all things where it might happen, it might not. You might get a really welcoming group of people who take that on board, but maybe you don't. And we probably all walked into places where you don't get a great welcome, not necessarily churches, but all sorts of places where actually, you can tell the places that have intentionally worked on their welcome and the places that haven't.
Yeah.
And I guess culture is important for an organization to be successful, isn't it? That actually these organizations which have a really strong sense of culture tend to be highly effective at achieving their purpose. They tend to be effective at doing what it is that they want to do. When it comes to Apple, they have a really strong sense of culture, and it helps the buy-in in terms of the products that they have and actually, Starbucks have a really strong sense of culture. The reality is their coffee probably isn't as good as some of the places that you can get coffee, but you know what you're going to get when you get into Starbucks.
But in the early days, thousands of people would go to a Starbucks cafe and drink average coffee. But because the atmosphere was great and they were playing jazz and you could sit there for as long as you wanted and you could work on your computer, you can do what you wanted to do. It was the meeting place for the people during those first couple of decades. That's why Starbucks was so incredibly successful.
Yeah. So it was more about the culture than it was about the coffee that they actually achieved.
Absolutely.
And I guess that underlines one of the things that we have often talked about when it comes to culture. I think something that we learned from Mal Fletcher, but something I've heard you say a lot, Tom, is about the fact that the strongest culture will have the greatest influence. That actually
exactly
the organizations that are successful, or the community that are successful, that are influential in their society, are not the biggest organizations necessarily, but they are the ones with the strongest sense of culture. And I guess Starbucks is a great example of this kind of upstart coffee shop that actually achieved kind of global domination based on having a really strong sense of culture. And out of that strong sense of culture,
Yeah.
they were able to influence their society.
And let's face it, places like Nero or Costa's may have a little bit better coffee. There may be the niche little coffee stores around the city where the coffee is so much better, but the ambience is missing.
Yeah.
So again, it's what are we seeking to create? And at Proclaimers, right at the very, very beginning, I wanted a place that was contemporary. I wanted it to be relevant. You know, everywhere I go in the UK, I see these dirty, dusty, old grey buildings that you got to walk through a graveyard over the tops of dead people to get into their churches. There's these wooden, uncomfortable pews, and there's a funny smell when you walk in. Now, I'm not trying to be critical. These places have created that kind of a sense. I don't know, maybe by default or whatever, but I wanted something different. I wanted a church without the boring bits. I wanted a place where the language was relevant, where the people that stood up would speak with intelligence. I was at a ministers' meeting a couple of months ago, and one of the young pastors said to me, he said, I hear that you've got a lot of intelligent and articulate leaders in the life of your church. I said, well, yes, we do. He said, how did you do that? I said, well, they were attracted by me being intelligent and articulate as well. I said, we specifically went to university students to populate our leadership because they were smart, they were savvy. Many of them were doing like proper courses, you know, like medicine and, you know, that kind of nursing, and unlike like political science and philosophy. Okay, so a lot of people were doing like, hey, you know somebody, one of the, yeah, he became one of our pastors as well. But intelligent, I think we termed a phrase called London thinkers. We wanted to think like big city, even though we are in the UK's smaller city, Norwich.
Yeah.
And so by design, we sought to speak in a language that unchurched people could connect with, understanding that, you know, the people that we wanted to attract into the life of our church had never seen a Bible, never touched a Bible, never heard anybody read the Bible, had no idea about Daniel and Goliath and Noah's Ark and all those other stories. And so we sought to intentionally create a culture where people could come in who knew nothing about Christianity, who knew nothing about church, but could somehow connect. That's what we wanted to do. Our music was the same. You know, coming back to my Southeast Asian experiences, food was a very important thing. You know, many of you will remember that we had hundreds of opportunities where we would buy Indian food and go back to somebody's house. We'd buy Chinese food and go back to somebody's house. We'd go to some, you know, kebab shop and sit around until 1 o'clock in the morning. We'd go down to the university at one of the coffee shops and we would sit there and we'd eat really bad food just so that we had the opportunity to get together with everybody and chat and talk. You know, that was all done intentionally. You know, we did that not by default, but by design. And so, you know, back in Asia, music was a really important thing. You know, one of my most exciting messages I ever preached in Thailand was about sticky rice and barbecued chicken, where every Bangkok person would say, oh no, we don't eat that. But really they do. And so I played on that. You know, people still 25 years later remind me of that message that I preached. It's creating culture, it's connecting with people, and that's what we really wanted to do at Proclaimers.
Yeah, I guess it's that sense of relevance, wasn't it? It's, you know, actually language that people were speaking. I guess, you know, hearing you talk about all those areas, it reminds me of a saying, you know, everything about you says something about you. That actually, you know, all of these different aspects come to form the culture. But one thing I wondered about, Tom, you know, is this just something that the church kind of, and I've heard this asked a few times, is this just something that the church took from the business world? Is it something that we stole? You know, did business get there first? What would you say to that?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the church lost out on what culture was all about a couple of hundred years ago. And I think that by default, they rode the wave of their own personal success at that particular time. You know, up until about 45, 50 years ago, the UK, Britain, would be called a Christian nation. The US would be called a Christian nation. We would refer to Christian Europe. Those terms don't work anymore. We're into a post-Christian or even what's after post-Christian? Non-Christian, I suppose. But, we're talking about groups of people that no longer relate to the church. And the church, I think, lost out on what they were trying to create. I think the world is, let's say, some parts of the world in business have done a really good job with this. Mind you, I've been to a lot of places. Went to a restaurant recently. I won't say where. Walked in, beautiful decor, wonderful service, but the food, which is the main reason you go there, the food was really lacking. Now, thankfully, the service said, "We're so sorry you didn't enjoy that. Let's comp that for you. We'll take that off the bill." And I said, "Thank you." My wife said, "Shall we go back again?" I thought, why do we go to a restaurant? It's for the food. Everything else is complimentary. And I think some businesses have lost out on that. I think some businesses, customer service, for instance, when you walk into a store in the United States, "Hey, sir, how are you today? Is there anything I can do to help you? Oh, please, feel free to call on me at any moment. Let me help you." You walk into some stores over here and it's, "Yes."
Yeah.
It's, or you're totally ignored. Customer service. We don't want anyone to ever feel ignored, from the car park to the front door to in the atrium. And we've got people that intentionally go up to new folks to say, "Hi, hello, how you going?" We've even got people out in the car park that sort of keep an eye on some people that find it really difficult to get out of a car to get into the service.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of speaks to what you were saying about, how important the food is, that actually at the heart of the culture of our church is the hope that we would actually be representing God well in our world. And I guess, when people ask me about, whether we took the idea of intentionally designing culture from the business world, I say, well, actually, when I read the Bible, I think the greatest example of a cultural architect is actually Jesus. Actually that Jesus,
Exactly.
the Son of God, God with skin on, steps out of heaven and walks on the earth. And as he does so, he actually is the living embodiment of the kingdom of God. And everywhere he goes, reasserting what the kingdom of God is like, reasserting the culture of the kingdom. And I guess that you see that in, all sorts of ways. I think that Jesus is really intentional about modeling culture, but also really intentional in the way he speaks about culture. You think of some of the more famous, one of Jesus' most famous messages, I guess, the Sermon on the Mount, where he actually says this whole load of "blessed are the ... blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are these people, blessed are the others."
Yeah.
That's Jesus saying, these are the things that are valued in the culture of the kingdom that I've come from. And as he heals people, he's showing that actually the kingdom of God is a place without suffering and is a place of where there's a journey toward wholeness and healing. And, time and again, we see Jesus saying the kingdom of God is like, don't we? That actually he tells all these stories about, well, this is how things work in the kingdom of God. So, would you say that Jesus is a great example of a cultural architect, Tom?
One of the things that impresses me about Jesus the most, and is something that I have very intentionally tried to do something in the life of our church, is Jesus says, "Whosoever believes in me." And I've taken that "whosoever" to heart. Just recently in church, maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, before the lockdown, I called out to the church and I said, "Whoever walks through the door of our church, we're going to receive. Whoever walks through the door, we're going to accept them and receive them." Now, Christian churches are notorious for their judgmental attitude towards people whose behavior doesn't match up to theirs or to what they understand to be right. I've said to myself, what right do I have to judge those who are outside of the church? Paul made that comment in one of the letters to the Corinthians. And of course, it's a rhetorical question because the answer is none whatsoever. We're not called to be judgmental of the whosoevers. Judgment, the Bible says, begins in the house of God. And so oftentimes, areas where correction, instruction, confrontation comes in place in the life of church, which is also part of the culture of our church. But when it comes to people coming in, firstly, what Jesus did, he spoke to them. He broke every cultural rule, for instance, when it came to speaking to the woman of Samaria in the book of John, chapter 4. Jesus went out of his way as a Jewish rabbi man to speak to a woman at midday who was a Samaritan, as far as the Jews were concerned, a mongrel individual, no purity to blood, etc. But in turn, Jesus revealed himself to her as Messiah.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I want to be like that. I want our church to be like that. I want our church to be able to reach out and to touch the hearts and lives of the unbeliever.
Yeah. And I guess that shows, why it's so important to have a strong sense of culture that actually allows you to have a voice and an influence in society. Thinking again about the Sermon on the Mount, in the Message translation, it says, let me tell you why you're here, doesn't it? I think Jesus talks about how we should be a city on a hill. Again, I think it's quote Mal Fletcher again. I think he talks about the fact that the church should be should model in microcosm what the city would look like if God was in charge. So actually, when people come into our church, they should get a sense of, well, actually, this is what church looks like. This is what a place or a community looks like when they are passionate about following God. And I guess the way that you've described that with Jesus is maybe quite different to what people have experienced sometimes when they think about church. We went out on the streets years ago, didn't we? And we said, well, tell us what you think about church. And so often we heard people thought the church was boring, the church was irrelevant. But also, the conversations I have with my friends, they think the church is a judgmental place. Is actually
Exactly.
can't come in, they won't be welcome. And it's so powerful to hear about how intentional you were, Tom, about shaping something that looked very different to that, but very much more like what we see Jesus modeling in the New Testament.
One of the things that the Christian church seems to be strongest about is, for instance, in the areas of morality. The Christian worldview of what is right, what is moral. Some of that could go into, ethics or sexual morality, marriage, etc. And, theologically, the church could be quite correct about all of those issues. But, Jesus, when he was confronted with a woman caught in the very act of adultery, cutting a really long story short, at the end, after all of her accusers had gone, he said, where are those who condemn you? She says, Lord, they've gone. And then he makes this comment, neither do I condemn you. And I think to myself, one of the things that Jesus is notorious and scandalous with is the fact that he doesn't condemn people. The Christian church condemns people. Gandhi says, I like your Christ. I don't like your Christians, though. Because these Christians, they condemn, they judge, they're harsh and belligerent. When in turn, the Bible says it's the kindness of God that leads people to repentance. Repentance meaning a changing of mind about who God is. It's the kindness, the gentleness, the grace of God that leads people to receive Christ. So why should we be harsh and judgmental towards people? I've got no idea, but Jesus modeled this kind of culture to us.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things I was thinking a little bit about culture and, our kind of current situation, in the kind of social distancing. And, I guess this conversation might have looked quite different if we were thinking very much about, our kind of usual Sunday experiences gathering together in a community. But, actually right now, I think, well, what does culture look like? But actually it becomes much more about what we as individuals do, doesn't it? I think that actually I was thinking kind of culture, once it's kind of taken on board, becomes character, doesn't it? In a way, it actually starts to shape the way that you as an individual live. It's not just about, somebody, I remember my boss at work used to say that if you have to write the culture on the wall, it probably is because people aren't acting out the culture in the workplace. And actually culture is something that we take on board very much, isn't it?
You see, one of the things that helps to create culture is actually instruction and correction. When I lived in Thailand, my Thai pastor brothers would be constantly correcting my Thai, my tone, my pronunciation. And they were always there to, and they did it like they were being big brothers towards me, okay? They wanted me to fit in. They wanted me to get the best experience. In Thailand, when I spoke the language to just normal everyday people, it would immediately cause them to pause, to be shocked, to be surprised, and to think that, hey, I can actually talk to you. Even though you're a Westerner, you can speak Thai. I can talk to you. There's something about the way Jesus related to people, disreputable characters, riffraff, crooks, criminals, tax collectors, people that ran, publicans, people that ran pubs and women who were known to be sinful women, prostitutes. Jesus engaged in conversation with people. And actually, the Bible says people, they loved him. They wanted to be wherever he was. Thousands and thousands of people chased after him. So my thoughts are, let's follow the example of Jesus. Let's reach out to people. Let's try and create that. But correction is really important. Some of the early days, in some of the prayer meetings, I remember one young man jumped up and wanted to rebuke the devil and shout and curse the devil. And so I said, hey, we don't give the devil too much airtime in the life of our church. We want to spend time talking about how great Jesus is and how good God is. When it comes to correction, and Phil, being one of the longest serving leaders in the life of the church alongside of people like Gemma and others in the church, correction played a very real part in what we did. We needed to deal with things quickly. The quicker you deal with something, the better off you're going to be. I can still remember some areas where we had problems with singers and musicians, where they'd get a little bit like a diva sort of spirit, and would become very precious about, what they wanted to do, etc. And yet correction and confrontation came in so quickly that we made it really clear, this is not acceptable behavior as Christians. Today, for instance, talking about the kindness of God and being gentle towards all men, I must be honest, I'm a little bit horrified at the partisan nature of some of the political and social discourses that we see on places like Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. I love it when someone says, I don't think Facebook is a really great platform for us to continue to discuss this. Let's find something better. Give me a call. But, I see some of the things that are said by Christians, and I'm horrified. Listening to Carey Nieuwhof, he says one of the biggest criticisms of the church is we're too political. We want to be for this political group or for that political group. And I was really saddened when I heard that when our Prime Minister got very sick, the number of harsh, horrible comments that came out on Facebook. Now, mind you, it was on the Sky News app, so I don't think they were Christians. But again, some of the harsh words that were spoken to a man who's now sick. And I'm thinking, I don't want the church to act like that. And by intention, we're trying to seek to develop a gentler, kinder spirit towards people around us, that we don't need to be harsh or angry or belligerent or judgmental.
Yeah, I think it's so powerful to hear you talk about how correction forms a key part of that, Tom. I guess I hadn't really considered, when I thought about what shaped our culture, how important it's been to actually say, no, that's not us. This is us. That actually we want to be known for what we're for, not what we're against. And actually
exactly. Living in Bangladesh for 3 years, being a Muslim, Hindu community, etc., they ate food very differently to the way I was used to eating food. They would use their hands and fingers to eat. And for the life of me, I just couldn't do it. They tried to teach me. They tried to show me how to do it. I had curry sauce up and down my arm, all over my face, all over my shirt. And they said, hey, let's just get you a fork and a spoon. I just couldn't do it. And the reason is, this is really important, I am not Bangladeshi. I'm a Westerner. I'm an Australian. I don't eat food that way. Are you hearing what I'm saying? They sought to bring correction, but I couldn't accept that correction or put it into practice because genuinely, I am not Bangladeshi. But when it comes to the kingdom of God, there is something that we can do. The Spirit of God within us helps us to emulate and to exemplify the grace and the kindness of Jesus. And the way that Jesus reached out to the leprous people around him, to the immoral people around him, how he made the heroes of his story some of the most despised people in the community of his day. I just thank God that we are able to walk with Christ inside of us, who in turn helps us, if we're smart, to develop his nature and his character towards people around us. This has been a great conversation, Phil.
Yeah, I've loved it, Tom. And I think just one of the other things I want to emphasize from what you talked about was actually you were talking about, learning to speak the language and how powerful it was when you spoke the language and how that helped you get connected into culture. And I think that's one of the things that's been clear as well, is that actually language really helps to create culture, doesn't it? Actually language creates culture. And just to hear the way that you've spoken about, actually that's the kind of language you want to be speaking, language that's relevant, language that, is inclusive, language that is gracious. And I just think there's something so powerful to think about that as well, but actually, how important it is, because, the situation right now is that sometimes language is what we've got, right? It's comments on social media. That's actually what's in our hands. And actually, how do we speak? How do we interact with those? Do we have that positivity? Do we have that hope? Do we have that belief in something better as well? And it's so powerful just to remember how important language can be in creating culture, expressing the culture of who we are.
It really is important. Learning how to speak 21st century.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have this conversation with you, Tom. I think that's we kind of, our aim was to talk for about half an hour, so that's about half an hour. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be exploring some of the aspects of our culture. There are 5 points of our culture that we'll be talking about over the next few weeks, exploring in a bit more depth where they come from, how they are played out in our lives and in the life of our church. And we're also going to be doing a bit of a live Q&A off the back of this. Once you've had the chance to watch this, we're going to do a live Q&A, and all of the details about that will be up in the comment section when we post this online. But thank you so much, Pastor Tom. Thank you for taking the time out to talk about this. Is there anything else that you want to say in closing?
No, I just love our church. I love the culture of our church. Having worked with our 2 campuses, it shows me the challenge to actually replicate that culture in our campuses as well. So for all the guys that are listening in Ipswich and for Bratislava as well, we want you to become as close to what we are, not as different to what we are. It's a design, it's an intent, it's doing things on purpose. And I think that's been the great secret to who we are at Proclaimers Norwich. And Phil, you've gone a long way to help create that as well. So thank you so much. Bless you, man.
Thank you, Tom. Great to chat to you.
See you soon.
See you soon.